Thank you very much for listening to this. This is Dr. Sean Yoder, and today we are doing Chapter 5 of Macroeconomics. Now, this chapter is more like we're just going to put our toe in the water, get a sense for the macroeconomics, because Chapter 1 through 4 is pretty much a review of the micro. So we're just going to put our toe in the water, review them, get some terminology for macroeconomics, get a sense of it, and then go from there. So remember, microeconomics is focused on individual industries, individual decision-making units, firms and households. Macro looks at the aggregates, kind of the forest for the trees. And it's because there is this aggregate behavior where something's happening that the microeconomics doesn't catch. So like the price level of all the prices going up or down rather than just an individual price due to supply and demand features. So the key thing we're going to be using and looking at is aggregate behavior. Now, as we study aggregate behavior, all employment of everybody, not just one person or not just one part of the labor market, there's going to be an attribute that happens, and generally speaking, this is the difference between short-run phenomena and long-run phenomena in macroeconomics, and it's called sticky prices. The idea goes something like this. The idea goes something like this. Imagine you work, and you do a contract with your boss, and generally speaking, you're hired and you get an annual review. 2 months into your term, inflation goes way up. So all the prices go way up. Now, as the prices go up, that means your boss can sell their stuff for more money. The cost of the other inputs, the capital, the electricity, the raw materials, everything else is going up. But your pay doesn't change. It doesn't normally change until the annual review, at which point you may or may not get a pay increase. So for that short period of time, your boss is actually earning more money, higher profits in the short run. So they'll respond one way. But in the long run, when all the prices finally adjust, then you'll respond the other. This sticky price is commonly in macroeconomics the difference in what's causing short-run to long-run phenomena. So there are going to be three major things that we're going to look at. We're going to look at output growth, or GDP, unemployment, and inflation and deflation. Now, for output growth, we measure it with GDP. Now, there's kind of this roller coaster effect with the economy. It goes up, it comes down. It goes up, it comes down. It goes up, it comes down. And each of the highs, when it goes up, tend to be higher, and each of the lows tend to be higher. Now, this up and down business, we call this the business cycle, and it looks a lot like this. Now, the business cycle, ups and downs. Whenever you hear on the news, today GDP came in at 2.3% annualized rate, what they're talking about is this blue line, ups and downs. When an economist talks about economic growth, we're talking about this line here, this trend growth line. The United States for the last 100, 150 years has averaged around 2.2% long-run growth, trend growth line. When you hear a politician, oh, I can do 3, I can do 5, I can do 10, try to get in a bidding war with growth numbers, yeah, they might be able to do it. But not this line. What they're talking about is this. And here's the thing. Whenever this gets really steep, whenever politicians talk about, oh, I can goose the economy, to a professional economist, what we hear is this sound. Do you know what that is? Yeah, it's the sound of the roller coaster. Do you remember what follows when the stops? Right? A lot of screaming, hands in the air, and hopefully you're not behind me while I'm spewing. Pardon the image, I'm sorry. Okay. Now on the way up, we call it an expansion or a boom or a recovery. On the way down, contraction or slump, recession is a technical thing. As we mentioned earlier, a recession is 2 periods of negative back-to-back growth. 2, minimum, 2 quarters. That's 6 months, people. You have to have 2 quarters of negative back-to-back growth in a row at a minimum. Now, you could have 4 straight down. That's just a bad recession. But 2 periods of negative back-to-back growth, that is a technical recession in the United States. Careful, the definition of recession is different in the United States than they use globally. So the down, contraction, correction, recession, slump, all kinds of words. Now, depression used to be. Now, if you had taken this class in 2019, I would have said, well, if you use the word depression in macroeconomics, you're basically referring to the Great Depression, because the worst macroeconomic shock we've had since the Great Depression in real terms was the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009, and that wasn't a depression. Yeah, welcome to 2020. We still haven't figured out COVID-19, but the COVID-19 unemployment numbers, the COVID-19 economic devastation, we've blown away the Great Recession, okay? The only legitimate comparison to the COVID-19 economy is the Great Depression at this stage. That's it. That's all we got. So while the term depression in 2019 was like, okay, if you're using the word depression, you're talking about the Great Depression. We're not really convinced of that anymore. So, yeah, we'll see what history writes about what we're all living through. Okay. So be careful of this graph. First of all, notice on the x-axis is years, but this is aggregate GDP output. Now be careful here. This is not a normal scale. This is called logarithmic scale. Notice the distance between 1,000 and 2,000, the vertical distance. That vertical distance is the same as from 2 to 4 and 4 to 8. So a double is the same distance. So you go, hey, wait a minute, that's supposed to be the worst thing since the Great Depression. Well, what about this, Professor? Yeah, but that's because it's logarithmic scale. You put this on normal scale, and this is going to look much bigger. I'll show you graphs of it later. Now, unemployment. Unemployment sucks, multidimensionally. It sucks to be unemployed, clearly, but as a useful economic metric, unemployment sucks. Professional economists don't like using it. Now, there are things in the unemployment rate when they release it, Department of Labor, that are useful. But in general, the unemployment rate sucks as a metric. It tells you where you've been. It doesn't tell you what you think it's telling you. We're going to do an entire chapter on unemployment. Now, unemployment is the percentage of the labor force that's unemployed. Now, be careful there. That word labor force, that does not say population. Percentage of the labor force. More on that after the first exam. Now, inflation and deflation. Inflation is an increase in the price level. So think of it this way. Imagine you've got a bunch of boats. Inflation is the tide coming in. It lifts all the boats. Yeah, maybe there's a wave that has one a little lower or some higher, but it's like the tide. It lifts everything. Deflation is like the tide going out. Everything comes down in general. Now, there's this phenomenon called hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is when prices go up very rapidly and it really disrupts things. Here's an example of hyperinflation. Here is a note from Zimbabwe, notice 2008, $100 trillion. Yeah, they printed a $100 trillion note. Isn't that brilliant? I'd like to add, just the month before, they were doing, or a few months before, they were doing billion-dollar notes. So what happened is inflation was so out of control in Zimbabwe. The day you were paid, you got your paycheck, you had to go and immediately, and I mean immediately, spend all your money. If you wait until the next morning, you could buy about half of what you could the night before. It got so bad in Zimbabwe in this time, people in Zimbabwe revolted. In southern Zimbabwe, they said, don't pay us in this Zimbabwean dollars, pay us in South African rand, the currency of the country to the south. And in northern Zimbabwe, they said, pay us in US dollars. Yeah, George Washington, they demanded to be paid in dollars, and they would use dollars to buy stuff, and they wouldn't use the Zimbabwean currency because the hyperinflation with that currency was so bad. 100 trillion. I mean, okay, just stop and think about this for a minute. It takes time to make a new note, right? They created this note. Okay, great. They had to do the artwork and put in the anti-counterfeit and then print all the. So they knew that they were so screwed that they had this cooking up for 60 days before they ended up having to print and use it. Yeah, welcome to hyperinflation. We had a bout with some pretty bad inflation in the United States, late 70s, early 80s. It really sucked. And if we just put you through the could you do this of what they were going through in the late 70s, early 80s, a lot of people are like, no, that really sucks. That bite's actually pretty bad. And it does. You really don't want hyperinflation. So when we talk about sectors, components of the economy, you've got your households in the private sector, and you got firms that are supplying things. The government buys and sells, and so does the rest of the world. So we've got to deal with each of these independently. So you remember the circular flow back in chapter 3. Goods go one way, money goes the other. If you're trying to account for economic activity, you just put a nice little slice. You can add up how much Professor Yoder pays in Starbucks coffee, or you can add up how much Starbucks receives from Professor Yoder in coffee. Those two match. And when we get to national income accounting, I'll walk you through how that happens. However, there is a type of payment that doesn't count. Guys, this one gets me hot. I'm sorry, this one bugs me. The idea goes something like this, okay? If I take a $100 bill and I hand it to my son and say, here you go buy something with this. When my son buys something with it, that counts in GDP. But the fact of me just giving my son $100 because I love my kid, that transaction from me to him doesn't count. Well, okay, that makes sense. It's just transferring money. But there are certain things that don't count. And the idea is these are unearned. There was no good or service that passed the other way, like Social Security. Really? I don't know about you, but if I went up to my grandparents, especially my grandmother, and told her that she didn't earn her Social Security benefits, she would whack me upside the head harder. I mean, seriously. My brain would go from 0 to whoa in like less than a second. Veterans benefits, because we clearly didn't earn those. Welfare payments. SNAP, TANF, these kind of things. Some of these I understand, some of these I don't. Because what they call transfer payment, I call deferred compensation. But because these have always been that way, they always will. Now, when the Social Security benefits are paid, then they count. When the veterans benefits are really hard, guys. I struggle with that one. Welfare payments I can get a handle on as far as the transfer nature of it. But I'll tell you, expect sometime this term I'm going to try to slip by a question from you where I give you all these different activities and I slip a transfer payment in there and I say which of these activities does not count on GDP. Okay? Expect the question. It's coming at you. Be ready for it. Okay. So, general markets we're going to look at. Goods and services market, you pretty much understand. The labor market, you did in a micro way. We're going to talk about it in a macro fashion and macro policy. And then the money or financial markets. These are going to be the three main things we're going to look at later. For goods and services market, rest of the world buys, government buys. It's not just households and firms anymore. Labor market. The government demands labor just like businesses do. But we also get supply and demand of labor from the rest of the world. I've worked overseas in other countries. People from other countries come and work here. We're going to talk about that. Then there's the money market. Now, the money market is where people save and borrow. Households can borrow money. Those of you who are taking student loans, you're borrowing money against future earnings. People also save in order to earn more money for things like retirement, etc. So the government borrows by issuing bonds. These come in all kinds of flavors, T-note, T-bill. For those of you who are going on in economics or business, EC 318, we talked about this in pretty good detail. Rest of the world borrows and lends money to the United States. When we get to the end of the class, the very last few chapters, we're going to talk about the global financial flows and how they work and what is needed for those to be sustained. So Treasury bills, notes, this is the federal government when it needs to borrow money. When the Congress says spend more money than they've authorized to be taxed in, that's called a debt, federal budget deficit. And so the Treasury is required to go and raise the money. So what do? They say, I'll promise to pay you $1,000 in 10 years or so. What will you give me for it now? And you say, I'll give you $700 now. And they say, okay. Give me $700, you give them $700, and they promise to pay you $1,000 in 10 years. There you go. Some corporations can also borrow through the bond market. Banks are very good at this. Some big corporations can do it. Most small corporations can't. Now, bonds pay interest. Interest is taxed in a certain way. But then there's a share of stock. Shares of stock give you ownership in the company itself. So years ago, I, for fun, day traded. And generally speaking, whenever I day traded or did any trading, when I sold out my position, I would only sell enough shares to get my original money back. And then the rest, I would just let go forever, especially if they were dividend pay. So Years ago, I earned several shares of Disney. So what I did is I was actually able to get the Disney shares, the physical share certificates, very uncommon now. So I've got these share certificates and I framed it and put it up on my wall. And when my kids were younger, like in kindergarten, they would come in. This is before I even had my PhD. The kids would come in and they'd look at what was framed on my wall. And they'd be confused. And they'd go, Mr. Yoder, sir? Back when I was Mr. Yoder, before I was Dr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, sir, why is Mickey Mouse on your wall? And I'd look at the kids and I'd go, that's right. Mickey Mouse works for me. And their eyes would get big and they'd be like, oh, really? Yep, it's true. Mickey Mouse works for me. Oh my goodness. Instant street cred with a 5 to 8 year old crowd. Totally awesome. Anyway, now some shares of stock pay out dividends. Not all shares do. And dividends are part of the profits, in theory, that are paid to shareholders in order to, as part of owning the company. Disney usually pays a dividend, although there's a move now to cancel the dividend temporarily due to the COVID-19 mess. But we'll see. Dividends are taxed and are treated very, very differently than interest. All right, guys, pay attention to this slide. Your grade in this class is going to depend on knowing the difference between these two and all the functional ins and outs. There are basically, if you think we should, and it is controversial, try to smooth out the business cycle or the government should have any involvement. There are basically two ways the government can affect the big economy. The first is fiscal policy. Where it says government policies there, strike that out. Fiscal policies are policies by the Congress and to a lesser degree the President. By the Congress and to the lesser degree a President. By the Congress and to a lesser degree the President regarding your taxes and how much they buy. So if the Congress decides they want to build a new destroyer at Bath Iron Works in Maine, that's fiscal policy. Congress decides to fix the potholes on I-5, that's fiscal policy. If the Congress decides to build the wall, that's fiscal policy. If the Congress decides to finally properly fund the Affordable Care Act, that's fiscal policy. All right, I want you to see what I've done here. This isn't about what the money's spent on, okay? I don't care which political side of the aisle you are. If the money's going out, generally speaking, it's fiscal policy. Now, you can agree or disagree with how it's spent. But if the money's going out, it's generally fiscal policy. Taxes, the same. So this is Congress and the President. The second major category is monetary policy. These are tools used by the central bank of whatever country you're in. In the United States, we call them the Federal Reserve. To control, now strike that out on your sheet where it says short-term interest rate. Just put a line through it. To control to control the money supply. And eventually interest rates. But they have direct control over the money supply. Now, Federal Reserve has no say in your taxes. They have no say in how the government spends the money. That's fiscal policy. That's Congress and the President. Equally, Congress and the President really have no say in the control over the money supply directly. That's the Federal Reserve and the central bank. So please do not become confused. Please disabuse yourself of any ideas of the crossover of these two. You need to understand that these are separate coordinated by separate institutions, and you're going to be responsible for knowing the ins and outs of how these tools work. So after the first exam, your second exam is going to cover monetary policy, and your third exam is going to cover fiscal policy. And I've split it up because honestly, monetary policy tends to be a little harder. So by putting it in the second, you get a little extra chance to study that in case you need to for the fourth exam, and it tends to work a little easier. And then fiscal policy tends to honestly be a little nicer than monetary over time. So we're gonna, after the first exam, we're gonna skip around in chapters a bit, but it'll be all right. So macroeconomics, Great Depression. Great Depression sucked. Basically, before the Great Depression, macroeconomics was run by what was called Say's Law. Say's Law was, if you think of Field of Dreams, build it and they will come. Everything before the Great Depression was focused on the supply side of the economy. Make it, make it, make it, make it, make it, make it. We just need to produce, make more stuff, make more stuff, make more stuff. Then into the Great Depression, a guy by the name of John Maynard Keynes basically said something really profound. You can make all you want, but if nobody wants it, it's still crap. And eventually, it's going to stop. Keynes took the supply side ideas of the economy and flipped it and made it demand side. And the idea was this: if people demand it, someone will make it. If people demand more comfortable face masks, somebody's going to make it. If people demand a face mask that won't fog up your spectacles, please, thank you, eventually someone's going to make it. Demand drives the economy. Demand drives the economy. Doesn't matter what you're making. If nobody demands it, you got a problem. Now remember that business cycle, the ups and downs. There's a controversial idea called fine-tuning. The idea goes something like this. The power of the federal government through fiscal policy and the power of the Federal Reserve through monetary policy should be used to flatten these ups and downs closer to trend growth, or be used to make sure trend growth becomes as steep as possible. Why is that? Because if you go really steep up, just like a roller coaster, the steeper and the higher you go, the more puke you're going to have to deal with on the way down. Now, I want you to understand this idea of fine-tuning is controversial. Post-1980. Everything before 1980, Republicans and Democrats generally agreed that fine-tuning was a good thing. But after 1980, there was a rift, and there was an ideological split. And the ideological split went something like this. One group said, yes, we should still do this. We should definitely fine-tuning. The government should be involved. The other side said the government is a cure that's worse than the disease. Those are the two sides. So just understand, I realize Professor Case, may rest in peace, and Professor Fair definitely have kind of their own opinions, and I sort of know what they are. So I'm going to balance a little bit of it out, and I'm going to talk about different things in different ways. But just understand this idea of fine-tuning is not, it's not settled in the United States. Honorable people disagree about this. Now, I'm a New Englander, guys. I'm a New England Pats fan, which you've learned through earlier lectures. And I love New England because New England people are jaded. Oh, I totally get this. New Englanders have this fundamental insight into life, that any amount of pleasure must be paid for by equal or greater amounts of pain and suffering. So you go up to some New Englanders like, hey, would you like to go out and have a good time? And they're like, no, we're good. Why? It's like, no, man, I've got as much suffering as I can handle. I don't want to add any more. Which is pretty jaded at times. Which makes me in macroeconomics, I love macroeconomics, totally get it. Generally speaking, you get one bad, one good. You can pick whichever you want, okay? You could have stable prices as a good, but nobody has a job. You know, unemployment's really high. Or everybody could have a job, but inflation's out of control and nobody can afford the milk. Which do you want? One bad, one good, take your pick. Totally get it, okay? But then there's this weird phenomenon called stagflation. In stagflation, you get both bads at the same time. You get high inflation and high unemployment at the same moment. Now, there's a group of economists that are the stagflation guys. Every time there's a downturn in the economy, these guys crawl out of the woodworks. Oh my God, it's stagflation! Oh my! And then it turns out not to be, and then they go back from whence they came. Now, these stagflation guys, they are not completely crazy. Okay, let's be clear. Any economists were already suspect to begin with because we're economists. But that said, the stagflation guys are not completely crazy. It has happened twice. I jokingly call these guys the teddy bear and blanket people because I'm convinced that when they were little kids, their teddy bear and their blanket were ripped from their childhood hands, and they blamed it on stagflation. They just never got over the trauma because wherever they go, that's all they see is stagflation. Whenever you run into one of these guys, it's kind of cute, actually, a little funny, maybe a little depressing. But anyway, we're gonna talk about them before the third exam or the second exam, and I'm gonna lay out what they saw, how they think, what they believe. They're not completely crazy guys. They've got a plot. They've got a point. It's not anyway. So just understand there is this phenomenon where you get two bads at the same time. So here's a new graph. This is aggregate real GDP. This goes back to 1970, the timeline. Now, the grayed out areas are recessions. So this, okay, this is the bad one in the 1980s. Okay, this is the one just before Clinton. Here's the dot-com bust, and then that's the Great Recession. Looking at that, you can definitely see going back to 1970, there's not really anything comparable to this. This was definitely a thing. So here's the unemployment rate. All right, you ready? This is going to be shocking. During the recessions, unemployment generally goes up. Isn't that shocking? There you go. Here's the two high inflation areas. We'll talk about this later in the term. Especially just before the third exam, we're going to really delve into this once we have our model built so you can understand what's actually happening in the macroeconomy. And that's all. So thank you very much for listening. If you have questions, please give me a call or stop by office hours, or we'll go from there. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a good day.